2015 to 2016, and is still very much engaged in related initiatives at Georgetown and beyond. We're also delighted to welcome Professor Kieran O'Neill, the Usher Associate Professor in History at Trinity College Dublin, whose recent publications include Power and Powerlessness in Union Ireland, and also edited a really critical volume with Finola O'Kane, Ireland, Slavery and Caribbean, Interdisciplinary Perspectives. And again, from a project point of view, he is the co-PI on Trinity College Dublin's Colonial Legacies Project. And he's joined this morning by Professor Patrick Walsh, who is Associate Professor in 18th Century Irish History at TCD and co-director of the aforementioned Colonial Legacies Project, as well as the director of the Centre for Early Modern History. And Patrick, again, is prolific, among other things, working on a number of projects. I want to, flag for the group as well that he is, along with Kieran and their postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Moby Hussein, working on a monograph on their TCD Colonial Legacies Project entitled Cultivating Virtue, ? Trinity's Colonial Legacy. So please join me in welcoming our panelists to the table. So I will note further that unfortunately one of our panelists, Professor Maurice Jackson, unfortunately is not able to be with us this morning. Maurice, of course, is a stalwart on these issues and would have greatly contributed to our conversation. So due to unforeseen circumstances, he's not able to be with us, but he sends his good regards, and I know that he's thinking of us this morning in terms of our discussion. So I'm going to open the conversation. And again, the idea is to kind of essentially make this as broad as possible to give our audience here a sense of, where we're coming from, the projects you've been working on. And David, if I could start with you, could you give us today some sense of, Adam mentioned this in part, but Georgetown's historic experience of enslaved people and issues of race pertaining to that?
Okay, so it was the summer of 2015 when President Joyce started investigating the possibility of, the issue of building names on campus, one in particular that was named after one of the presidents of Georgetown, who was one of the two architects of the infamous sale by the Jesuits in the Mid-Atlantic region of slaves that was ultimately then effected in 1838. This particular president had been a very successful president in the early part of the 19th century. He, with the Jesuits, had been deliberating an awful lot in the 1820s and 30s about the plantations that the Jesuits owned and whether they were serving the purpose that they had been acquired for, which was the support of Jesuit works and Jesuit living initially the colonial period. So the building name had become an issue because the buildings were being repurposed into dormitories. The buildings that particular building had been named at least for 100 years after this particular Jesuit. And in the repurposing, a question arose, should this be an opportunity to rename it? And President Joyce sort of faced a fork in the road. He could have done it with a swipe of the pen, and no one admitted the wiser. It was the summer. Nothing is quieter than the university campus when the session is not, when school is not in session. And that was then a decision he made is in fact to convene a working group to investigate not just the particulars of Thomas Mulledy, but the question of Georgetown's connection with slavery. And that was the inspiring moment for the working group, and the working group convened over the course of a year and made a set of recommendations. If I were going to distill my own lessons from that project, and why, in fact, it turned into something significant for us, and really it became a story that attained a certain amount of national and even international attention. I think I would maybe distill it down to these 4 points. We discovered that history matters, and particularly the history in archives matters, which was very encouraging for us as scholars on this committee, but it is not sufficient. In fact, a scholarly history of Georgetown's connection with slavery was pretty well documented already in modern scholarship from the 1980s forward. The question were people paying attention, and did they see implications for it? And there have been some small attempts before, but they never had a long shelf life. The second is then context matters. And 2015-16, it was a very tumultuous period. It was the end of the Obama administration. There was a presidential election going on, and there was tremendous racial unrest in Ferguson and Baltimore, and you had the white supremacy shootings in Charlotte, all as the group was convening. Third, so context matters. Third, maybe the emergence of the descendants as well, really, they'll ultimately become leading participants in the whole discussion. And part of that was watching them emerge as a group and learning how to incorporate their voice into the conversation and letting their voice take the lead. That is one of the things that's distinguished, I think, Georgetown's project from a lot of other ones, is the way that the descendants have engaged us and have really taken such responsibility for guiding us through this process. And then maybe the fourth thing I'll mention is the sense that, at least for our conversation, religion has mattered an awful lot. It's been an important part of the inspiration behind even President DeGioia's initial prompting of the program, and the sense that there's a set of religious obligations that impel us to consider this more seriously and consider the implications. And in conjunction with that is the religious conviction of the descendants, and a shared religious conviction that comes from a very tortuous history, as you can imagine, but one in which a language of moral responsibility and moral response is a shared language. And it can be very painful at times, the way that is used and brought up, I would say, from the Jesuit and the Georgetown side of things, but ultimately very salubrious and helpful to the project. And I'll just contrast it with conversations that really the most helpful conversations along this line was with Professor Maya Moran, who's a law professor at Toronto, who is very involved in the Canada's dealing with residential schools. And in our conversation, she would have said, quite frankly, that the kind of the religious language was not shared and would have been very unhelpful in those conversations. So I want to recognize that as something that was particular to this situation, really ultimately essential to the way that it looks like now, but not maybe necessary for all projects of this sort.
Thank you, David. That's really helpful. And I really appreciate that contrast with other projects. Very often we think of, international examples as being models, but we also need to problematize and look for the particularities, as you suggested, of our unique cases. And Georgetown is one of those. If I move over to our colleagues at Trinity College Dublin, and Kieran, perhaps you could take this, just give, for those in the room today, some sense of Trinity's historic connections to these issues. And then moving forward, Patrick, and you might be able to speak a little bit again about the particular project that you've worked on over the last few years.
Super. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for coming out. Georgetown was a big shaping influence in our own project, and we'll speak a little bit about that, how it diverges and how it aligns. And what's interesting about working on colonial legacies with universities is that each university has its own unique history and positionality in the society it's in and globally. And each legacies project that emerges from them tends to be different for that reason. So I'm going to try and explain, and I'm not going to assume much knowledge about Trinity College Dublin, so I'll begin right at the beginning and try and explain where our legacies project emerged from and where it's at right now, because it's still ongoing. So Trinity College Dublin is founded in 1592. I like to say it's at the sort of middle point between the foundation of the colony of Newfoundland, Britain's first major overseas colony, and the founding of the East India Company. And the timing is significant, 1590s, Elizabethan, and best understood as a mix between an ancient university on the UK model and a frontier university on the American colonial model. It's really where it sits. It is a Protestant foundation intended to have been founded for the greater proselytization and advancement of the Protestant colonial mission in a largely Catholic island. So it is from the outset a colonial machine. Right? It's an instrument of a colonial power. And where it diverges from the American universities is that its land is given to it in a series of confiscations and then grants of discovery by three successive monarchs. So that's Elizabeth, James, and Charles. The land proportion that's given to Trinity College Dublin, this is not widely known even amongst our own student body, equates to about 1.2% of the total land mass of Ireland, 18 of the 33 counties, 204,000 acres, thank you, we think, circa 204,000 acres, which makes it the third biggest single landowner in all of Ireland. And if you know Ireland well, that's about roughly the size of County Louth. So absolutely enormous estate for one university. That's important on a couple of different levels. It means that the main funding that comes to the university actually comes from the colonization and conquest of land from Irish people. So if you like, our native confiscation land relationship is predicated on that. Trinity is the beneficiary of the colonization of Irish land. It's not the beneficiary of the colonization of other countries to the same extent. So its relationship to Atlantic slavery is conditioned by that. So that's the sort of basic history of Trinity College Dublin. It has obviously changed a great deal in its 430 plus year history. Nowadays, it's a modern 20,000 plus undergraduate university with a hugely diverse student body. That will be significant for our project in just a moment. But for the majority of its history, it has served a Protestant elite within Ireland itself, and that's its positionality. Okay, that's Trinity. Our Colonial Legacies project comes about in 2020, 2021, and it's born out of what I call institutional panic. That panic is a response to student protests that crop up in the wake of George Floyd, and indeed indebted massively to Black Lives Matter across this society. So our students protest outside the Signature Library, one of the main buildings in Trinity College Dublin, which was then called the Berkeley Library. Berkeley Library had only been built in 1967. It was then called the New Library. It became the Berkeley Library in 1978. They protested in front of Berkeley for reasons I let Patrick go into more detail on, but because Berkeley was, in addition to being Ireland's most famous philosopher, some would say only famous philosopher in the 18th century, he was also an enslaver of people in Rhode Island during his sojourn there. So our students protested against that. The university administration do what university administrations do in that moment. They panic, flail around a little bit, and try and find solutions from within the faculty and student body itself. Those conversations became quite enriching. You know, we all learned a lot from them. What emerged from that was a project that was sponsored from the Department of History, involved Patrick and I as co-PIs, and then led to the hiring of a brilliant postdoctoral researcher called Moby Hussain, who you'll hear from later today. So that started in earnest in 2021, and it positioned us, I suppose, at a time when monuments and universities and their relationship to Atlantic slavery was heightened and was also very, I would say, kind of sort of vivid or sort of exciting place to work in. And we began to look left and right at projects such as the one here at Georgetown, such as the one at Glasgow, and so on, for inspiration. And we tried to figure out, okay, now we have the opportunity to do something with our colonial legacies. What do we do? Well, we don't have 272. We don't have an emblematic number like Georgetown. We don't have benefactions that come from Atlantic enslaved sugar plantations. We have a different set of circumstances. So what we decided to do was set up essentially a hybrid public history project and Orthodox research project which meant that we would do our work transparently from the outset through working papers, through working across the university as much as possible. We shared our work as it emerged in the form of audit documents and then working papers on the two central issues that came to the fore very quickly. One was the Berkeley Library, and the other was the return of human remains we had on campus, some of which have been stolen from the natives broadly defined in Ireland, and some of which have been stolen from a worldwide nexus of sort of racial science projects. So we said we would prioritize these two issues in the first 2 years. And where we're at right now is that we have, in this time since 2021, denamed the Berkeley Library, and we have returned the first of our human remains under the project. And what we have, I suppose, instituted, which is maybe where I'll hand over to Patrick to think about Berkeley and what we learned from that, is a process which is transparent and also public-facing in true public historical style. Rather than the university taking decisions on colonial legacies and then presenting those decisions to a wider public, we have in fact created a system organically and through a wonderful amount of mistakes, which we'll now mask in our descriptions, a system where the public itself has been invited to put in submissions, which are logged, made public for open discussion, and then become part of the decision-making process, even as we make it in the university. We think that's probably what distinguishes our project from most others. And I would say we're enabled to do that partly because we don't have the present issue of reparations to deal with, which has freed us up to some extent to be even more transparent in the work that we're doing. And that's interesting. What enables that particularly is the positionality of Ireland relative to Atlantic history and slavery, and where we fit in as sort of both colonized and colonizer. And Dara began this session sort of reflecting on that unique positionality that Ireland has. But maybe I might hand over to Patrick on that score.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the invitation to be here. It's a great privilege. I think Georgetown project has hugely influenced our thinking in all sorts of ways. And I think some of the engagement issues felt all sorts of parallels. I think even in terms of the engagement, descendant communities, the way we've had to deal with communities that wanted their ancestral remains back. And we come back to that later. I think that's a really intriguing sort of story. But I want to say something about the George Berkeley story, because it's kind of where it began. And like at Georgetown, it began with the name of the building. And we were all aware of George Berkeley. But most of us, and I'm an 18th centurist, I had taught some of Berkeley's works, we hadn't really thought about Berkeley as an enslaver. And it had been sort of minimized in scholarship on Berkeley. It had been relegated to a footnote in the classic history or into a run-on subordinate clause of a 10-clause sentence in standard history of Berkeley in America, which is kind of interesting how these things become excised and erased that way. And when this kind of call came in initially and said, well, can you tell us, you're the Asian centrist, tell us what's the story of George Berkeley and slavery? Let's go looking. And what we discovered was that there's kind of two parts of this story that I think are really interesting. And it's interesting how this develops in terms of how people began to think about Berkeley. But in terms of his context, he had been a very significant philosopher. He had been a fellow of Trinity. He had written some of his most influential work in his early career in the 1710s. He'd then become Dean of Derry in the north of Ireland after an extended grand tour of Europe. He spent about 6 years touring various aristocrats around southern Europe. Comes back with ideas about luxury and the decrepitude of Europe and the need to escape that and to think about colonization. So he doesn't go to Derry. Instead, he thinks, I want to go to North America. And he writes this prospectus, an essay on the colonization of plantations with the object of planting a university. And his aim was to build a university called St. Paul's in the Summer Islands or Bermuda. He'd never been. He was looking at atlases and he went, I like this. It's far from the mainland, so it's uncorruptible. It's a nice verdant landscape. This will work. So he writes this prospectus to the university. He connects it into the foundational sort of description and model for Trinity. He names the founding fellows at the back of this pamphlet, which includes three recent fellows of Trinity. So it's going to be sort of offshoot. That's important. So there's a kind of university connection from the beginning. He lays out what he wants this university to do, and there's two things he wants to do. He wants it to be a place where colonists can be educated, but he also is thinking about educating Native Americans, and that's really important. But he's also aware they may not want to come to this university. So he explains in this pamphlet that they may need to be kidnapped at a young age and taken to this university to be educated, to be sent back as missionaries. And this becomes a model for later institutions. So we think about Dartmouth to some degree, we think about 19th century Canada, and we think about all sorts. So there's a genealogy here that's important. And he's also thinking about colonists, he's thinking about slave owners, and he's selling this project in London, he's collecting subscriptions for it, he's looking for government approval. And he's kind of waiting for that, but he's got enough money. And some of that money, interestingly, comes from colonial activities. Some of it comes from a bequest from a woman called Esther Van Homrich. Anybody who knows anything about Jonathan Swift, she is sort of Swift's key love interests. She lived in my hometown, and this bequest ends up being the sort of seed money. So he goes to America while waiting for Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, to approve his what we might call a federal grant. And it doesn't come, that's not forthcoming for a while. So he ends up in Rhode Island. And when he arrives in Rhode Island, he realizes that maybe I'll start here. So he acquires a plantation and immediately acquires at least 4 enslaved people. There could be more, but we know of 4. And we know of them. This is where it's quite striking. There's Philip, there's Edward, there's Agnes, there's Anstey, Barclay. What's interesting there is he baptizes them in the church in Rhode Island. And that's important because Barclay also writes in one of his key pamphlets propagating this scheme that slaves should be baptized as a means of control. So he's entering into a major contemporary debate about the baptism of slaves, and he's practicing it. And we have the deeds, and they're in the Barclay papers, they're sitting there, black and white, deeds of sale and purchase of these people. And yet have been sort of elided from histories of Barclay, who just focused on the great philosopher of immaterialism. And he stays in Rhode Island for maybe 18 months. The money's not coming. So he decides to leave. He leaves this plantation to Yale. It's still owned by Yale. It's on a 999-year lease. Will expire in 2762. Yale or there. It's now owned by the colonial daughters of America. There is no sort of history of or leased by, and there was very little engagement with its sort of history. He leaves his books to both Yale and to Harvard. So he has a critical sort of intellectual engagement. He's in an intellectual engagement with those institutions. A medal is established at Yale in his memory. The first beneficiary is Eliza Wheelock, who becomes founding president of Dartmouth. So little Aaron Burr is another beneficiary here. So there's a whole sort of story. So he's very influential. And to some degree, Yale were the first university. Their early project in 2001, the student-led project, sort of uncovered some of this Barclay enslavement story. And again, that's important. And again, it was a residential building that was named after him that they needed to think about. So we then end up with this controversy in Dublin, this realization, maybe we should do something about this. And what's striking was the people, so, and we had a number of sort of discussions about this. We produced a working paper outlining the sort of the story and the evidence. And again, the evidence I think is really important. That scrupulous dedication to historical records and archives is critical. And people raise questions like, we're 4 people. That's not significant. So you have to kind of understand that all enslavement is significant. So you're trying to explain that. But you're also realizing that people started to understand that Barclay as a theorist of slavery became more important in that debate. And it led to, in terms of taking the story forward, in terms of process, we then had to, so we had come up with this as 3 historians with little power of the institution to really shape this. With the great encouragement of the Chancellor, who we tried to hear, we'll hear from later, who was our advisory board chair. So the institution had to do something. They established a working group. And again, working groups are vital here. And we decided to do this in public. So we put our working paper out to the public. We invited submissions on why the library should be denamed. So we had 92 public submissions on denaming the library. And evidence, and people writing in really detailed reasoning of all sorts of reasons why this should be done, from eminent Barclay scholars explaining, yes, the problematic Barclay has shifted in our perception, to people were writing in from a sort of African American studies, Black studies programs, and explaining about why this needed to be done for now, from student voices, huge numbers of student voices, like this building doesn't represent us today in the 21st century. And that led to a process where eventually the board of the college eventually decided to dename the library with some opposition. And there were opponents, and there were people saying, look, he's a man of his times, leave the 18th century alone. You're all woke, all this sort of stuff. But the library was denamed. That became a major story because it also became an international news story. So people started asking questions of Yale, and they passed that away to some degree. That it's been investigated and has been reported in David Blythe's work on Yale in terms of the Berkeley connection. That's important. And Berkeley University in California got questions. Because again, Berkeley's the colonial tracks that shaped the naming of that, and his sort of line westward, the expansion and empire goes, has been critical in shaping its foundation. And again, they thought, well, no, our legacy is really the 1960s, and we're fine. So there's an interesting massaging of their public history, which I think is something that's intriguing. So we ended up with a denaming, and we then took this a second phase. So again, doing this in public, we started to invite public submissions to rename the library. And we had 800 suggestions from the public. So we had enormous public evidence base. You had to justify it, connected to the university. And only last month, the library was renamed after the Irish feminist poet Evan Boland. And the first building named after a woman on the campus. Campus that's been there since 1592. And it was a really extraordinary moment, and again speaks to the ways and just that rethinking of the monumental landscape, and how legacy projects can both be about changing, thinking about how we think about the past, but how we think about the future. So I suppose that's where we're sort of at that story at the moment.
Thank you so much for that really rich and very thoughtful series of reflections on Trinity's connection to these issues. And I think we've learned a lot in terms of the specificity of those examples. But to bring the two projects into dialogue, and Patrick, you mentioned, among other things, that working groups matter. And I'm keen to explore on both of your parts challenges that you may have faced in terms of working groups, presumably by virtue of any committee. There are different voices with different priorities, different directions, but also perhaps institutionally, to what extent was there oversight in terms of your directions? And so how did you navigate those challenges? Just open to the floor.
Yeah, okay. I might, so as historians working in public, what we learned through this process, I mean, historians are antisocial people, are more inclined to be stuck in a windowless archive and happy in that environment, like the sort of modes we are. Than working in public and engaging with people who don't necessarily have a grounding in history or maybe a wide knowledge of context, as Dave was talking about just a moment ago. So what we learned from doing this work is that you have to be willing to take criticism. You have to be able to take it. And you're going to get criticism from the left, broadly speaking, for engaging in what's often characterized as institutional optics exercises, the sort of dark side of inclusion and diversity initiatives, which is about cleaning up the reputation of an elite institution and repackaging it for the moment we're in now, but retaining its elite characteristics, right? So it's sort of a modern neoliberal university that we all engage with one way or another. From the right, you're typically characterized as engaging in a sort of a liberal woke, identity politics influenced work. And to some extent, those critiques are worth hearing, right? In both directions. But it means that you don't have a natural allyship. So this is where the institutional bravery and support really matters. So what I've learned as one scholar in this is that you get change when optics and ethics align, right? So when the optics align with a right thing to do that will be accepted by a big enough constituency, then you can work with an institution for change. I'm very clear-eyed about that. I understand that in a different moment, we don't get these outcomes. So you take the window that you have. Our window was facilitated by the two brave provostships, excellent support from our former president, and current Chancellor Mary McAleese, who really pushed at key moments when we were encountering resistance. Because remember, we had no mandate. We had no power. We're just three historians raising issues and hoping the university will take them seriously. That did happen, and I'm profoundly grateful for that, actually. And we can see how the spaces for these things to happen are shrinking right now globally. So it waxes and wanes. But I'm always optimistic, I think. So those are the broad things. I mean, Patrick, there are really things here like STEM, humanities, and there are lots more things to talk about, I think.
I think the other thing on working groups, I think it's striking in terms of what I've read at Georgetown, what I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that from David, but is the inclusivity really matters. That we had a working group that had representatives of academic staff, but also technical staff, of students, vitally, of people from all across the university, and all interests represented. So you had sort of administrators, that you have scholars, you have students, you have those voices, and all equally participating and shaping something. And I think that really matters. I've been able to listen to as many voices and been able to bring in experts. We had a couple of outside experts who, at the various points, were able to drive things and say, look, you guys you're not thinking big enough, and you're just thinking institutionally. You're still bound by sort of time. And I was struck by Darrow's reference to Trinity time, or there were on Trinity time, but people used to moan about that the whole project was running on a slow sort of Trinity time. The universities moved too slowly. This was so that I think there's, that cajoling and pushing, and the working groups work best when they're doing something that's publicly accessible, but also has as many different interests. And you realize that your mode of thinking may not be shared by colleagues. And like when we dealt with human remains, like STEM colleagues had entirely different worldviews and understandings of things. And, you have to respect that. You're trying to understand it, and it's really difficult. So I think, and having those conversations was very, very complex as a result, because, so I think, broad expertise, willingness to listen, willingness to realize that you're going to make all sorts of errors, drive these projects really well.
I actually think in retrospect, as far as the working group went, we had it very easy. I mean, exactly what you think about. Okay, a working group, a university committee, we were 16, and on a topic as volatile as this one. And why did I ever accept to be chair? I think but the fact of the matter is we worked really well together, and we did have we had faculty from a variety of departments, with a concentration of historians. We had students, we had alumni, we had an administrator or two, and at least in terms of what we did for that year, which is what our mandate was, it was to consider the building names and to consider the broader history and to make it better known. We really worked very collaboratively. I mean, at the end of the year, I could not have been more grateful for the ways in which the committee worked together, and where even in disagreement there was, and I think it had been a tone established by folks from the very beginning, is that the disagreements are not disrespectful, right? That we all had a sense that we were engaged in a common project. And we had the support of the university administration, and it was non-interfering. The tensions that emerge are the ones that you can imagine, right? Is exactly as they were spelled out. There's a number of critiques that can come from across, a wide ideological spectrum. I sometimes think, at least for us, the more serious problem, as it were, was not between those who thought it was an awful project and those who strongly endorsed it, but it was more the spectrum of those that wanted to be highly engaged and those that were not interested at all. And it was a topic we returned to a lot, since part of our mandate was to get the history known, right? And here it was very humbling for us as historians and scholars, right? Really good scholarship had been done since the 80s. And as a Jesuit, and I started in the Jesuits in the 80s, we had been, as a Jesuit, as part of our training, we learned the history. I think why in the end I was turned to as chair is the responsibility for teaching that history to young Jesuits had fallen to me around the year 2000. And so I was familiar with the history at that level. The discussion that we would come back to is okay, there's a kind of student in particular, think about a student body that's going to be highly engaged, but there's a far larger percentage of the student body and the alumni and the other constituencies of the university are not necessarily going to be engaged or they're going to shrug it off. And so how do you engage that and say, hey, this is important, right? Our treatment of this history is important for you to know. This is part of the community that you are part of, and that you're proud of in so many respects. And there's a shadow side to this history, and we should make this part of our sort of collective and historical memory to know that this is part of the world out of which we emerge, and that is still part of us today. So I'd say certainly there was this experience of critique, though I found negative critique was not so strong, honestly. The critique that was at least the one that would capture, well, okay, so there was I can remember some conversations with alumni who were hostile to the idea and who may have seen it as a kind of wokeism. And there was a line that it devastated me when I had a thinner skin back then, and the line was, "Is you're trying to erase the history by changing the name." And I was thinking to myself, do you realize like what a devastating accusation that is to a historian? I mean, it's like there's not a more serious form of malpractice, and this is not what we're trying to do. And it's in these quick exchanges. Finally, I developed the lines. We're trying to tell the history better, not erase the history. We're trying to tell the history better. And the building names I think capture that. And then we named one after one. There ended up being two buildings. One after an enslaved person that was at the top of the bill of sale, Isaac Hawkins Hall, which is over there. And then the second one was the renaming. It came from I think it was one of the 5-year master's program student who found the name of a young Black woman, free Black woman who had run a school for Black children on 36th Street, right off campus. At the very same time, this is the poignancy of it, at the very same time that the Jesuits were deliberating whether to sell the enslaved or not, she was trying to educate free Black children across the street, and she ultimately becomes a sister in the Sisters of Divine Providence, which is a religious order in the United States for women of African descent. It still exists today in Baltimore. And that's the Amory Brecac building that's right out there. In terms of tension and public scrutiny, it starts to heat up really when the New York Times starts covering things. And as chair of the committee, I sort of felt on behalf of the committee that our motives were always put in their worst light, and that we were viewed as negatively as possible, and a sort of pressure of, you need to do this or we'll report on it this way. That was tough to get used to. That's one. And then another great complication was the emergence of descendants. And there it's an interesting aspect too. So again, as a Jesuit, long before this, in the 80s, working in parishes and in schools with African Americans, I knew people that claimed and knew themselves as descendants of those enslaved by Jesuits and Catholics in the colony or the early stage then. And then I remember one line very touches me to this day, a woman who helped in the sacristy cleaning up things, who said to me, again as a novice, so in my first few years as Jesuit, "Oh, my family has worked for your family for a very long time." And, and I mean, she was wonderful to us in a way that when you think about the history was, all the more, in a sense, devastating internally, but also reconciling, right, in terms of that aspiration, which is at the heart of our program. But what emerges in the course of 2015-16 is a larger and larger number of descendants, and a bit of what had to go on and couldn't go on in the year that we had our mandate is that, first of all, folks themselves had to think of themselves as descendant and decide, did they want to take that on as, part of their self-understanding. And then even if they did, it's not really clear then, well, what kind of engagement do you want at Georgetown? So a bit, especially in the second half of the year, was kind of learning, okay, you know what? We're going to move the project forward, and what we have to do is make our invitation and our openness as broad as possible as this group of folks is starting to think about themselves in light of this history and trying to decide what kind of engagement they want. And the fact of the matter is, even today, 10 or so years later, there's a tremendous diversity among those who understand themselves as descendants in terms of how they want to be engaged with the Society of Jesus, how they want to be engaged with the university, and with various degrees of, celebration for what we're doing or antagonism, the whole range of reactions. And we have to learn how to accept that, right? And any anticipation, this would be the other thing. We never know what's around the corner, right? And you can't, right? Things are going to emerge, and you have to be open to that and let yourself be moved accordingly by your best work.
These are really powerful testimonies from all of our contributors. I think you'll agree. But we're going to open up the floor now, and I'm really keen that this is a conversation over the course of the day. So all of our panels will have an open Q&A function for you to be part of the conversation. So we welcome, unlike most academic panels, we welcome both comments and questions. So the floor is yours if anyone has a particular question or observation they'd like to make. Yes.
Thank you. So I used to live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we, as you probably know, had a terrible incident there. And some of what you've been talking about has been resonating with what I observed going on in this place. And I just wanted to say, I think in the United States anyway, the issues of reparations is really, really critical. And that's where a lot of people will say, no, we don't want to do that. And that's exactly what happened in Tulsa. After almost 100 years of denying that this thing had taken place, suddenly, okay, we will allow all of this to emerge, but you can't be acknowledged financially for what happened. So I wonder if you could sort of comment on that, because you both in separate ways brought it up that Georgetown had that issue and Trinity didn't.
Yeah.
So I think it speaks to sort of lines that are drawn in the different societies as to where problems really will get complicated for these kinds of attempts to restore history. Thank you.
Talk about land. Yeah. So as I mentioned, our great benefaction is land. Trinity is compensated for its historic estates in the 1920s as part of British government legislation on the occasion of the independence of Ireland, right, just prior to partition, and through the 20s and 30s. So Trinity gets paid off for its estates that were confiscated in the first place. And what that means is there's a land transfer to a formerly peasant proprietorship in places like Kerry, Donegal, Armagh, and still visible in the landscape. And we know very well where those estates were. It's not always clear to the people who are on those estates now, and not clear to the student body. So there's a knowledge gap, and it was really interesting to listen to David talk about the knowledge gap and why that exists. Right? Universities have very powerful self-mythologizing functions, right? And we've learned this by doing this project all along. I'll let Patrick speak to particulars of that in a second. But the university tells itself it's a good university always, right? And that's what erases the past that you don't want to speak of. In Georgetown, that's slavery. In Trinity, it's lots of things, but it's also land and confiscation and colonization of Ireland. But the story resides outside the walls and is retained, right? And the university is at its strongest when it engages with that story outside of its walls, because there you start to get to a much closer to an actual history, that's based on a shared experience. So we found every step along the project that every time the university has been forced to jump out of its self-mythologizing functions and telling its own history to itself, it's starting to learn so much more, right? And everybody is gaining a great deal from hearing the critique of people who were former tenants of Trinity, from understanding that Trinity was a terrible landlord that treated its 71,000 tenants badly, right? Through indifference and lack of care. So I think the story of the university inside and outside the walls has become a really important way for me to understand what this is all about, also what everybody can gain from. But I think that really has shown through in some of our initial work on land. So maybe, sorry,
yeah, I think so. I think it's also interesting that I think sometimes when a university, and this is striking, I think, in terms of the Georgetown experience as well, is that when you actually engage further in these projects outside the university with other constituencies, you can't control the story. Mm-hmm. And you get people raising questions about reparative justice. So like the land thing is really interesting. It's something we're working on at the moment, because people are beginning to understand where their own inheritance comes from, where their farmland comes from, what this sort of past history, and there's a sort of amnesia to some degree about people's understanding of where their land appears from and who their landlord was and what that relationship was and their rootedness in place. A place really, obviously, really matters to people. So there's that element to it. But I think the other thing where this really struck us is that when we were dealing with islanders in the offshore island of Inishbofin, returning human remains that had been stolen by Trinity-linked scientists in the 1890s, then when we went down to talk to the islanders, and we were saying, look, we really want to help you. We want to bring these back. And we're really trying to do it. They weren't happy. And we felt we were going to some degree the extra mile by going down, sitting in community hall, trying to explain these things. And I'm like, no, you need to do this now. Why haven't you done this before? So I think that sort of expectation of reparative justice is always further than what you expect it to be. And the sort of dialogue and the impatience. And when I was reading about sort of people in Louisiana, the way they've been engaging here, I could hear the same echoes of just why haven't you done this before? Where's the real material gain? And I think that's what's really striking about any sort of reparations. I think the other thing just on reparations that is worth just noting in the context of all of our discussions today has been the sort of weaponization of reparations in terms of thinking about Irish indentured servants in the American colonies and in the Caribbean, as a way to sort of deny sort of reparative justice to African Americans, the Irish were enslaved first. It's absolute nonsense. But yet it's had a really strong purchase. So I think the ways in which those stories get sort of picked up, I think, is also hugely significant.
So I think one of the ways it's been helpful for me to think about this term, which, I mean, I'm coming from my background, it's not a word that I naturally would have cozied up to. It's not where I feel, by origins, would feel comfortable with, for obvious reasons. But in the course of these discussions, what I found is maybe to back up one word and to say, okay, the root of reparation is repair. And what are the ways in which a damage done and damage inherited, in a way that this is why legacy then becomes part of the whole term. What are the possibilities? And then with that, what has emerged in our conversation is, how do the descendants see repairing the history and the legacy insofar as it intersects with the Society of Jesus and Georgetown University? Here again, there's not unanimity of position among the descendants. And to be frank, not unanimity of opinion within the Georgetown constituencies or within the Jesuits, and that the complex that exists, the complex of institutions and people like alumni, people like administrators and Jesuits themselves. There is not a consensus. And a large part of that lack of consensus I want to allow is expressed in very good faith that there's not an obvious solution to the problem. What has emerged in this instance is a foundation, the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation, which is it's a foundation with a board that is principally descendants and a president who is a descendant, and which is in the process of being increasingly funded, trying to pull in resources that are the Society of Jesus is Proper and the institutions associated with the Jesuits, and also Friends, because there's a goal actually of $1 billion endowment. At this point, it's looking forward to 100 million. And the way that foundation is set up is that the fruits of the endowment will be used to generally address issues of racism in the United States. And then other portions are involved in the education of descendants, funding the education of descendants. And then a third portion is to urgent need among descendants. Now, it's moving forward step by step. I think it's a very exciting project. I think one of the things that's best, or a couple of the things that are best about it, are that the Jesuits or Georgetown are releasing the funds rather than a typical response is, well, we'll give scholarships, which is, for example, since it's schooling, which is a way that the money goes out and comes back in. And it's under the rubric of education is great, but this is it genuinely gives the money away. And then the board decides how it's going to be spent. So it started to spend the resources. But it's also important to recognize that not of all the constituents involved, from descendants to Jesuits to Jesuit institutions to Georgia, not everybody is on board with it, right? Not everybody sees it as a good way of proceeding. The one thing that it doesn't include, and this was a consensus reached by the parties who are involved behind it, is that if reparations means a direct monetary payout, it doesn't do that. Right? And the consensus within the people who are participating is that doesn't serve the kind of repairing that they envision effectively.
Excellent. So just in the middle here first, and then we'll get to everyone though.
What I find where the rub is, right, with the Jesuits and having been slave owners, as well as Bishop Berkeley, right, a man of the cloth, is this intersection between Christianity specifically and slave owning, because we all know that many people own slaves in the United States. And so I'm wondering how you represented particularly that contradiction in your conversations with the community, with the working group, and with the press, because slavery was naturalized at the time. And as I'm a historian of Latin America, and the Catholic orders were the greatest slave owners in Latin America. Mm-hmm. And that's not a question that I've seen addressed there. So I'm interested in what your response was when the question is, how could a Christian order, Catholic priests, enslave people? How did you address that? And did it come up in the case of Bishop Berkeley?
Yeah, let's just take Berkeley first. I think this is something that was really interesting in terms of Berkeley, was this idea of this Protestant clergyman who was, and he's also actively both as an active enslaver, so that came up as a question, and the sort of the ideal, because not every Church of Ireland cleric who was active and thought about these things would have agreed with them. Members of his own family were sort of against slavery in the 1690s, which is remarkable. Like he's an uncle who's a playwright who was producing Afro Bren's Orinoco on the London stage, which is extraordinary. But there is a sort of what's interesting, I think, with Berkeley is these sermons on the baptism of slaves, engaging in this debate that is going on, and it's a theological debate, and he is very actively so he's using that. So and it's a debate within Anglicanism about slavery, and I think he's a partisan of that, and that becomes a thing. That is something that I think people honed in on as a, but it also connects into the wider sort of university mission. But the university had, from its foundation, is essentially a religious seminary for Anglicanism, and its whole mission is guided by a sort of religious purpose. And I think that's something that we're sometimes not very good at talking about. We certainly in Ireland we tend to use religion almost as an identifier rather than a mode of thought and thinking and practice when we as historians consider it, we're really bad at that. But it's really, which is it's always bizarre, but it's really important in terms of thinking about how people justify their actions in all sorts of ways. And for a very, very long time, you can see this all the way through in terms of proselytization, in terms of evangelicalism, both in Ireland and sponsoring missions to the university missions in China, in India, that are also driven by this same religious kind of mission and sense of that. I think understanding the religious imperative of that is something that I think we still probably need to do more on to think about.
There's not an unequivocal teaching against slavery in Christian sacred texts or history. It's up to that point. So it emerges as it's a form of labor, and it's a way that the labor market is satisfied. And there's no dancing around that in terms of dealing with why religious orders and other people of Christian faith own people. And you just have to be frank about that. And there's a very different set of motivations and a contemporary way of understanding and balancing the sacred texts and teachings differently that now makes it abhorrent to us. But it's really not until the middle of the 18th century that you have coherent theology within Christianity broadly against slave holding and the slave trade. And the folks get into sort of an intellectual history of papal teachings here and there, and I find it's unclarifying more than anything else. But the basic principle is the Christian scriptures were not interpreted in a way that precluded the ownership of human beings.
Thank you for those very thoughtful reflections and responses. So there were 3 hands that I saw. We're going to group them together. So John, if you want to ask your question, and I'll get the other 2 hands, and then the panelists can choose how to answer. John,
thank
first.
you. In the instance of Georgetown, I think this would have some bearing. Do you have any comment or thought, or do you know anything about any pressure the Trump administration might be putting on with this push against DEI and so forth? And some of the panelists and attendees might be interested to know that this morning on the New York Times podcast, The Daily, Chris Rufo, a Georgetown alum, is interviewed about the way he'd like to steer the Trump administration to clamp down on liberalism on American campuses and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That's a big question. We're going to take 2 more hands. Sorry, just at the front here, and then the back as well. So just the front first.
I want to thank the panel for being open and saying things and actually being very honest in the comment. But I had one particular question for Professor Collins. You mentioned about not having consensus. Did that surprise you? And were there alternative remedies offered?
On the question of reparations,
Yes.
sure. There are groups of descendants that are associated with a larger argument, especially in the legal community, for in fact more concrete and direct reparations. That would be the one side, and the other side that would say it's among the descendants who would say really nothing is necessary. I think one of the best moments that this was captured for me, and with a clarity maybe that was a bit inchoate in my mind at the time, was we had the ceremony of contrition, which is when the President Joy on behalf of the university and Father Kosicki on behalf of the U.S. Jesuits formally apologized. And there were 3 descendant speakers, and each of them captured a different perspective on what the Jesuits in Georgetown should do. From the one extreme, where the speaker really leaned into, forgiveness, apologies, and all that is fine, but from the Catholic tradition, there's got to be penance. And there's, but this is where the language, right, and the shared values become really important, and she could speak that in a very powerful way. On the other end was a young woman who talked about ways in which her child had been saved by kinds of medical research that went on at Georgetown University Hospital. And that the best thing the university does to repair is to use the resources that are intrinsic to it in the medical school, and by extrapolation, the law school and things, to do the work that they do and repair that way. So that's where I'd say there were and there are other voices, and the foundation did their best to incorporate as much of that. But the danger would have been if we had the ideal of getting everybody on board, both on the Jesuit side and on the descendant side and the institutional side, we'd still be sitting here, I think, all with empty hands.
Thank you. There was another question, just if I take it back, I think.
I want to thank the panel as well, and then to raise up the example, which Professor Rothman knows more about this, I think, than I do. I'm a member of the Georgetown Visitation Community, which is very close by, just across the wall. And the sisters at Visitation was founded at the same time as Georgetown, and they've owned slaves throughout they own slaves throughout their history. I don't think they ever purchased slaves anyway, but many of the sisters came with slaves or they were gifted to them. And I'm proud that Visitation is doing work similar to Georgetown's in terms of researching and uncovering that history, and they haven't shied away from it, led by our very, very brave Mother Superior who's leading the whole thing. And they're facing the questions from the students. Adolescent girls are very piercing in their questions. We're supposed to be an order that values gentleness and humility. Why were there owning of human people at this institution? And it's been very painful, but also really life-giving from that perspective. And I think Visitation is far behind Georgetown in terms of thinking of how to repair, but it's beginning that process, and it's very exciting to see that. There's so many different parts of it. The sisters not only owned the slaves, but when many of you may know, when Abraham Lincoln ended slavery, the first place he ended it was the District of Columbia, and they started the process. The only place I understand in the United States where former slave owners could get recompensed for having their slaves suddenly freed. The very first person to file a petition for recompense was the Mother Superior of Visitation, who had she had 17 slaves, and they were all freed on that day. And so she was going to get her money back from the government, which is an unpleasant thought to think about that. But I think they're wrestling with it very well, and I think they're working with the Georgetown group here.
Just going, I think one of the things really interesting is is, I think, the ways in which people question these things and are asking questions now. And one of the things that I didn't mention, I think, is really important when we were going through this process, was the students kept raising questions about university values. What does university stand for now? And how do we align making change with what we think about now? In some ways, that's one way of getting around the difficult questions about saying, well, this is not the institution that I understand. Were we not meant to have done this? Well, it's now, maybe we can do that now. And I think it's, and I'm trying to think, well, what is it that aligns? So when we were denaming the library, it came down to, this doesn't represent the values that we imagined university as presenting itself today. Whether they represented us in 1978, that's quite possible. Or much earlier. But also, I think looking forward, I think values are a critical role there. And the other thing is slavery compensation is also a big part of the story in our side of the world. All the slave owners in the British Empire are compensated, including members of our faculty and their families. I think that's still the story that I think people who know nothing about this find most shocking. That they got their money back and those that worse than them didn't.
I could might add, again, I'm looking at this project and thinking of it in the context of a bigger issue, which is Americans, US Americans, making this history palpable and felt to themselves, right, more broadly. The advantage that we have is, especially at a US university, is we have this community of students and alumni for whom there is so much pride of the institution, and for whom they would say, well, yes, you know, that we were founded in 1789 is our history, right? And that we have one of the oldest research telescopes in the country, that's part of our history, and on it goes, right? Well, part of our history is this. And I think there's a way for a lot of students that, well, you know, this would intersect the communities that they grew up in and maybe their families and lots of other milieus that are part of their community. But there's something about a university community, for university students in particular, where there's some effort that's involved, but to say, you know what, this is our history, and we need to be at least as attentive to it as we're attentive to, you know, we started with the foundation of the country. It's our history. It's our history. It needs to be our own. And I think we're lucky then, actually, in that respect, living on a campus with students in communities where this local history can be it just sort of naturally important to the way people think about their membership in a community.
That's such a wonderful way to end this session. I know there's many more questions in the room, but we will have time for all of those today. And so please join me in thanking our panel.
Thanks, everybody, for remaining for this very short, very virtual tour of some of the sites on our campus connected to slavery, memory, and reconciliation. One side benefit of doing this virtually is that our guests, or remote guests, can actually join the walking tour this way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to. So I want to say a couple of things. The Chancellor talked about new territory. So think of this map, this walking tour, in a sense, as charting the territory of Georgetown University. Universities like Georgetown, like Trinity College, Dublin, are landscapes of historical memory. Very, very carefully cultivated and tended landscapes of historical memory, generally intended to promote this self-mythologizing that we heard about earlier. But projects of historical scrutiny, like we're engaged in, can re-landscape historical memory at our university. So I'm going to show you a few sites on campus that are part of our historical memory, that both shows us a few, that put some things on display and hide others. These are also sites that have been where a new history is being told about our university's history, but in every case, the landscape does not really speak for itself. You can put up a statue, you can rename a building, but if people pass by those structures without thinking about them, then they're just inert. So we have to do more than just rename buildings. We have to teach the history of those places, why they're named after the people that they're named after, and who might be missing from that landscape. So that's the idea. I want to say that this virtual walking tour is the fruit of student research. This came out of a class, a one-credit class I taught a few years ago, where the students wanted to do something to try to tell some of the stories about campus in a way that would reach more people. And so this virtual walking tour is the result of that. So there are several sites on campus that connect to the history of slavery, memory, and reconciliation. So the map shows you the locations of a number of these sites. And I just want to focus on a few, beginning with the statue of John Carroll, which I hope all of you must have seen as you walked through the main gate of campus. Now, John Carroll was the founder of Georgetown University, the first Catholic bishop of the United States. He was a Jesuit trained, a member of the Jesuit order, although at the moment that Georgetown was founded, the Jesuits were actually suppressed. Here in the United States, the Jesuits were able to transfer their property, including the people that they owned, to a civil corporation called the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen. And through that corporation, they were able to hold on to their property through the era of suppression and maintain their property through the 19th century. This corporation actually still exists to this very day. It still owns a lot of property. The statue of John Carroll says on it, patriot, prelate. It does not say planter. It does not say slave owner. But he was those things. Carroll came from the wealthiest, most prominent Catholic planter family in the colony of Maryland, a family that owned plantations across Maryland and hundreds of people. Very prominent. One of his cousin, Charles Carroll, signed the Declaration of Independence. His brother, Daniel Carroll, was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. This was a powerful, wealthy family. They stood at the apex of the Catholic slaveholding gentry class in the Chesapeake that founded Georgetown in the 1780s. And that class stamped Georgetown in its own image, so that Georgetown, the school itself, was a site of slave life, labor, and even death from the 1790s all the way to the early 1860s. Carroll, as the head of the Jesuits, also the head of the Corporation of Roman Catholic Clergymen, also was the head of this Jesuit plantation complex that owned plantations and people across Maryland. And as I mentioned earlier, the original model for Georgetown was that the profits of those plantations would help to subsidize the education for free white boys and men here in Georgetown. So that's the Carroll statue, and that's the history that is not proclaimed in the statue of John Carroll. Let's see what's next. We're going to skip over a few of these sites. Let's see. Let's go to Isaac Hawkins Hall next. Okay. Isaac Hawkins Hall is a particularly important site in terms of the process of renaming here at Georgetown, analogous to what has happened at Dublin, Trinity College Dublin. So this building, which is now called Isaac Hawkins Hall, was originally built in the late 19th century and was named after Thomas Mulledy, the chief architect of the infamous sale of the GU 272 in 1838. As you heard from Father Collins, it was the renovation of Mulledy Hall that was part of the provocation for the formation of the working group in the first place. And one of the consequences and one of the results of the working group, in part because of the work of the working group, but also because of student pressure, was that Mullally Hall was eventually renamed. And it's now named after Isaac Hawkins. Isaac Hawkins was an enslaved man in his 50s at the time of the sale, who lived on the White Marsh Plantation in what is today Bowie, Maryland. He was the patriarch of a very large extended family of Hawkinses at that plantation. His children and grandchildren also lived at White Marsh. They're all listed in the various inventories and censuses that were taken of the people who lived on those plantations. And his entire family was sold in 1838 and shipped 1,000 miles away to Louisiana. They were sold down the river out from under him. Isaac Hawkins himself remained behind in Maryland because the Jesuits thought it would be cruel to send the elderly people that they owned into what was essentially exile. This building is marked in a couple of ways now. There are signs about Isaac Hawkins Hall, but generally the students do not refer to this building as Isaac Hawkins Hall. They refer to it as the Jesuit residence, a series of buildings that were the former Jesuit residence. And a lot of students to this very day are really surprised to learn that this building is named at Isaac Hawkins Hall, and then even more surprised to learn about who Isaac Hawkins actually was. But there are now a number of sites on campus that are named after African Americans who are connected to this history of slavery or are more recent vintage. Father Collins mentioned in Beecraft Hall, which is just down the hill from here. The masjid on campus, the space for Muslim students is named after a man named Yarib Mahmoud, who was an enslaved African brought to Maryland up through the slave trade in the 1750s, who eventually made his way to freedom, became something of a minor celebrity in the Georgetown neighborhood. So there are ways now that these other kinds of histories formerly hidden are now highlighted on campus. Let's see. Let me just show you two more sites, and then let's see. Okay. So we're moving a bit forward in time. We start with Carroll from the 1780s, move to Isaac Hawkins, who designates the 1830s. And now I want to show you a really interesting and very little known site on campus. The trouble with this. Hang on. It's all. Let's see. Get this for you. Let's see. This is okay. Here we go. This is Georgetown's Civil War Centennial plaque. This plaque was placed on the side of this building that we're in, Old North, in 1961 by the Georgetown University Alumni Association to mark the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the Civil War. And in case you can't read it from where you're sitting or online, it says, from 1861 to 1865, in America's tragic epic of the Civil War, 1,138 sons of Georgetown in blue or in gray offered themselves on the altar of patriotism in the defense of the constitutional rights to which they were bound in conscience. This tablet is dedicated to their memory. Now, if we were in a class and had time, I would ask you, what do you think of the inscription on this plaque? But since we don't have time, I'll just tell you what I think. A few things. The first is that this plaque doesn't tell you that about 80% of the sons of Georgetown who fought in the Civil War fought on the side of the Confederacy, which tells you something about the tilt of the university in its early years. The second point I'll make is that this inscription is a classic version of the both sidesing of the Civil War. It says that basically both sides were fighting for the same thing, their rights of conscience and constitutional principles. What it doesn't tell you is that one of those sides was fighting for the preservation of slavery. And finally, the last point I'll make is that Georgetown's colors are blue and gray. Colors adopted in the 1870s, initially by the rowing club on campus, as the identity of the university to signify the reconciliation of the warring sides in the Civil War. Many students today at the university do not know that the gray and the blue and the gray is the gray of the Confederacy. So it is something, it would have been almost common knowledge some time ago, but now it is something that we really have to teach. And the students have a wide variety of responses to learning that history. But this is one of the ways that the legacies of slavery are deeply felt, wound very tightly into Georgetown's identity today. Blue and grays everywhere around Georgetown. Okay, one final stop on our tour, and then we'll head over to the library.
Has there been any impetus to change the wording on the plaque?
Nobody knows about it. The only people who know about the plaque are the students that I teach in my class. And they haven't yet, they're more concerned about the school colors than the wording on the plaque.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to find one final reason. Let's see. So one final stop on our tour of slavery, memory, and reconciliation is Healy Hall. We don't have Healy's. We have Healy's. We don't have Healy's photograph, but that's okay. So we started with Georgetown's first founder. We'll conclude with Georgetown's second founder, Patrick Healy, Society of Jesus, who was president of the university in the late 1870s and early 1880s. I mentioned him briefly earlier. So Patrick Healy is a fascinating figure who I think illustrates the complexities of history. He was born into slavery in Macon, Georgia in 1834, at the same time as the Jesuits were debating what to do about their human property. His mother was an enslaved woman named Eliza, and his father was an Irish immigrant cotton planter named Michael Healy. They had some kind of relationship together. They had several children together, and Michael Healy recognized his paternity to the children, including Patrick. He sent them to the North to be emancipated and educated in Catholic schools. Many of them went on to brilliant careers in the Catholic Church. Patrick became a Jesuit and president of Georgetown. One of his brothers became the Bishop of Maine. His sister became a prioress of a convent. The black sheep in the family became a Coast Guard captain in Alaska, where he was known as Blackjack Healy, but not because he was of African descent, but because he was so mean. Legendary figure in the annals of Alaska. But Patrick Healy, because of his ancestry, and he and many of his siblings, but not all of his siblings, were very light-skinned. And Patrick and a few of his siblings essentially passed for white during their lifetimes, which is the only way that Patrick Healy in the 1870s and 1880s would ever have been able to be president of Georgetown University, a school that was segregated until 1950. In the 50s, white scholars discovered, although it was always known to other folks, the secret of his ancestry. And by the 1960s, Patrick Healy was being celebrated around Georgetown as the first African-American president of a major historically white university. And he's become an icon of Georgetown's Black history, even though his Blackness was a kind of Jesuit secret. at the time that he was president. There are a couple of different plaques and exhibits recognizing Healy on campus now. And they tell, if you read the language closely, and it always pays to read the language closely, they tell slightly different stories about his ancestry and his identity, which is an index of kind of changing scholarship and changing mores around how we identify people. But he is certainly really symbolic of the incredible complexity of his history and the dynamics of racism that course through our history from its very beginning. That is just a taste, tip of the iceberg of what you can see around campus. So, question.
Yes, was he treated as a slave? In other words, working as children worked in on plantations before he came north, and at what age did these children, were they shipped north to become educated?
I think they were teenagers when they were sent north. If I remember correctly, I don't know what their treatment was like before that. We do know that later in life, as they became adults, Patrick and certainly James kept their distance from any kind of, from Black people in general, but also their one brother, Sherwood, who was darker skinned and could not pass. But I don't think they ever worked actually as plantation laborers.
You don't think they were?
I don't think they did. One other complexity to this story is that when their father died, Patrick and his siblings actually inherited his property, including the enslaved people that their father owned, and they ended up selling them and taking some of the profits and donating them to Holy Cross and other institutions. So again, complexities on top of complexity.
Was the Jesuit order ordaining people of Black ancestry in the 19th century, or do you think he kept his ancestry sort of hidden from the Jesuits?
The Jesuits knew. The Jesuits actually knew their ancestry. In fact, the executor of Michael Healy's will, and the Jesuit priest who becomes the patron of Healy's, was none other than Thomas Mulledy, the architect of the 1838 sale. They knew, but they kept it quiet for, we can speculate on the reasons, but they saw some reason to serve as patrons for the Healy children and kind of guide them through their careers, insulating them from any kind of racist attacks that they might have otherwise experienced. But the first kind of publicly Black identified Jesuits weren't until the 20th century.
You mentioned just now the connection with Holy Cross, another Jesuit, and Mulledy was also in there too. So it was dormitories named after Mulledy and Healy on Georgetown, on Holy Cross campus. Do you know if they're doing any kind of similar work that you all are doing here at Georgetown?
Holy Cross did a historical study of Mulledy and Holy Cross's connections to slavery, and actually the story about the donation from the sale of the Healy children to Holy Cross I know about that because of what Holy Cross did. Holy Cross decided not to remove Mulledy's name from that building. They added another name. I can't remember. Brooks, I think is the name. Yeah, Mulledy Brooks. So their solution was more additive than replacative. Is that right? Replacing. So there are different strategies for handling this history. But they felt it was important not to remove Mulledy's name. Part of their history and should remain there. Healy is such a complicated figure. I don't think anybody really knows what to do with him. I know we have to get over to the library, so I'm happy to answer any other questions, but I think we should wrap this up and begin our journey across campus. You'll see the Carroll statue in Healy Hall as you walk over to the library.
Well, it looks like everybody's back from lunch. That's good. Nobody wanted to leave immediately after the food was served. It's always a good sign. Well, thank you everybody for rejoining us. My name is Eamon. I'm a first year history PhD student here at Georgetown. I work with Professor Gannon, Professor Rothman. Mr. Gannon was kind enough to turn the mic over to me, where he wanted to rest his voice a little bit for the rest of the afternoon. And for the next hour, we'll be discussing the Black and Green Atlantic, how they're entangled with one another, and the work of some early career historians on the Black and Green Atlantic. They're going to introduce themselves at much greater length. That'll be my first question to them. But just to tell you a little bit more about our panel, we have Dr. Mobeen Hussain, who works now at the University of York, but one of the lead researchers on the Trinity Colonial Legacies project. Dr. Catherine Healy, who's now at Epic Irish Emigration Museum, although I believe a Trinity alumnus, so there you go. Trinity's influence is seen all around. Dr. Miriam Nayan Gray, who's at Mary Immaculate College, and then Gisela Garcia, who is at Concordia University. So to start us off, I guess the first thing to do would be to introduce the panel a little bit, and I'll let you guys do that. You're much better qualified than I am. So if you could tell us a little bit, firstly, who you are, the kind of research you're doing now, how you got interested in it, and what are the implications of your research for Atlantic slavery, Atlantic Empire, and I guess the connections between Irish and Black diasporas in the Atlantic world. And because we are on Zoom, I'll be there to traffic control over the conversation a little bit to avoid awkward pauses. Dr. Hussain, would you mind starting us off?
Hi, everyone. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've done most of my introduction for me, but as I mentioned earlier as well, I was the postdoctoral research fellow working on Trinity's Colonial Legacies project under the principal investigatorship, if that's a word, of Kieran and Patrick, and that was between 2021 and 2023. I'm now based at the University of York, where I'm writing my first book on race and colorism across colonial South Asia. However, I'm still involved in the project as we complete a research monograph based on our findings. So in terms of answering your first questions, I wanted to give you a sense of the two things I am currently working on, which are connected to the project, but also have some offshoots as well. So earlier today, you heard about the story about denaming and renaming the former Berkeley Library. And one of the things I've been interested in, as have Kieran and Patrick, have been thinking about connecting conversations over commemoration and memorialisation within Trinity to historic practices of commemoration over time across Ireland itself, particularly how the Republic contended with symbols of the British Empire after the establishment of the Irish Free State, as well as contemporary debates about public memorialisation across Britain. And some of this also links back to accusations or claims of so-called erasing history when we decide to dename or rename something or take a statue down, for instance. And within Ireland, that is a very interesting conversation, partly because those who are critical of this, the decision to dename and related projects, seem to kind of obscure, kind of conveniently have a kind of almost cultural amnesia around the fact that the Republic itself had to deal with lots of these issues around national narratives and what to do with public symbols of the British Empire and just symbols of the British and general symbols of the Empire not too long ago. So one of the publications I am currently working on is, like I said, connected to the Trinity Project, but is also kind of stemming from that, is a piece on connected histories of colonial and post-colonial commemoration. This was born out of the public process, as mentioned, around the campaign to dename the Berkeley Library, as our research findings our research had found that the library came to be named in the 1970s. And we also did quite a lot of research thinking about how other decisions were made at Trinity. So one of the things I do in this publication is to look at the successful decision to name what was referred to as the new library in 1978 so the decision to name it the George Berkeley Library, and compare that with the decision not to memorialise Republican and United Irishman Theobald Wolfe Tone some 40 years or so earlier. And Tone, again, is particularly pertinent as a Trinity man himself, and because he's a figure who looms large in Ireland and someone whose name was used again and again to rename bridges and to commemorate in other ways after 1992. Do cut me off if it's too long, but I just want to give you a sense of why I want to focus on these two figures in tandem, and then briefly give you a sense of some of the work that I'm doing before I pass it on to my panelists, fellow panelists. So why am I focusing on these two figures in tandem? Both figures have complicated and complex relationships to colonialism and New World visions, as well as their attitude towards the utility of using enslaved people beyond the often mentioned Berkeley's ownership of enslaved people. So earlier we heard about Berkeley's unsuccessful Bermuda scheme, as well as how many American universities benefited from Berkeley's visits and donations. And he was very influential within America in terms of thinking about both thinking through or propagating the view that baptism and slavery were compatible, but at the same time, more recent studies of Berkeley, notably by Tom Jones and Travis Glasgow, have shown that Berkeley actively impacted and promoted the influential York Talbot opinion of 1729, which stated that enslaved people could be held in the same condition everywhere across the British Empire. So again, you're seeing his impact beyond beyond the Bermuda scheme and early colonial America. This also extends to some of his work beyond when he returns to Ireland. He continues to draw on his American experiences in his writings on Irish political economy. In some writings from the 1730s, he includes references to the benefits of slavery and servitude to economic growth and public infrastructure in Ireland. He asks whether other nations have not found great benefit for the use of slaves in repairing high roads, making rivers navigable, draining bogs, erecting public buildings, bridges, and other manufactures. Berkeley's racialized perceptions were not limited to Africans and Native Americans alone, but also extended to the Catholic Irish. In his pamphlet Words to the Wise from 1749, he describes the Irish poor as a lazy, destitute race, comparing Black enslaved people in America to Irishmen. And in doing so, Berkeley advocated a racialized understanding of the Irish population while bemoaning the bad policy decisions that led to their circumstances. And this is definitely something I want to pick up later in our discussion about kind of the future direction of work on Ireland and the Atlantic, and thinking about how both Irish people and Native Americans, as well as Black people, have been racialized over time in different ways. And to briefly say about, sorry.
Oh, no, didn't mean to cut you off there, but if you'd like, I'd like to bring Dr. Gray into the conversation a little bit, because what you said about African-American, Native American, and Irish racialization could potentially feed into Dr. Gray's work on Black, brown, and green voices. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about the project you're on right now. Then we'll get back to you, Dr. Hussein, because we have a few more questions for you as well.
Thanks so much, Eamon, and it's a real privilege to be here. Thanks to Dara and Colleen and everyone who's organised, and it's lovely to be on the panel with Wobeen and Catherine and Giselle to kind of get an update on what people are doing. So thank you so much. I've been, so I was based at NYU for a decade and a half, and there I originated a documentation project, which was primarily initially an oral history project called Black, Brown and Green Voices, which was really about trying to amplify voices, the stories, the histories, the family histories and genealogies of Americans who self-identify of African and Irish descent. That was in gestation from about 2018, and then was kind of just getting its legs when COVID happened, and there was already some momentum built around. I'm really a scholar. I've spent the last, kind of decade and a half or 2 decades now studying Irish America, and it was really around this increasing, and a personal family, my own family connection made me more and more conscious of the whiteness of Irish American spaces and the community building potential that could be done there. So when COVID happened, we pivoted Black, Brown and Green to a public humanities dimension, and we're still archiving, conducting interviews with primarily it's primarily for a North American, a US audience around the ways in which the histories of people of African and Irish descent have come together, and they do, it's very, they're oral histories with people of a range of ages, from very young to older, and they come to this intersectionality in different ways. Some are from the legacy of slavery, and that's a whole other kind of thing that we could delve into in terms of that thorny or that difficult connection. And then others are more kind of just about trying to draw attention to the fact that not everybody in the Irish diaspora in the United States looks like me. And a lot of them look like my sons, for example, who are biracial. So African American Irish Diaspora Network is a 501c3 organization that came about in parallel to Black, Brown and Green Voices, and I fed that as a founding board member. We've kind of platformed Black, Brown and Green through the organization. And I suppose the big takeaway for me, and I'll stop, I can speak ad nauseum as some of you guys know. The big takeaway for me, it was, I was coming to this as an oral historian, someone who'd conducted a lot of interviews for the Archives of Irish America, and it's a very homogenous collection in a range of ways, not only around the binary of race in the American experience. It was kind of focused on the tri-state area. Most of our interviewees were of Roman Catholic, either had been raised that way or culturally. So there are a whole load of kind of biases in the collection just by its nature. But it became clear very quickly to me that the creating space and community building aspect of the work is actually more important now than the interviews, although I do think the interviews are important, and people will mine them over time. But that creating a space that was obviously oxygenated from 2020 onwards. And, for example, we hosted a St. Patrick's Day virtual Zoom event on St. Patrick's Day just passed, to bring together people who aren't in major centres of Irishness and who wanted to come together. And we had 60 people from Montserrat, United States, Ireland, Lagos coming on and wanting to kind of connect. And it's in this kind of fake virtual way, but the appetite is there and the scope is there. And there's a lot to be done, and a lot to be done in terms of educating Americans around what Irishness looks like today as well, because it's a transatlantic kind of thing. So I'll stop there. I hope that's sufficient in terms of an introduction.
That's excellent. Thank you, Dr. Gray. And on the subject of public history, public humanities, Dr. Healy, would you be able to share with us a little bit the work you're doing at the Irish Immigration Museum?
Thanks, Eamon. Delighted to be part of the conference today. So yes, I'm historian in residence at EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum. EPIC was opened in Dublin in 2016, and it takes in a very broad sweep of Irish migration history from the 5th century right up to the present day. So I primarily oversee our temporary exhibitions, which take a more detailed look at specific aspects of Irish migration. I took up the role in December 2022, and I've curated 4 exhibitions in that time, 2 of which have directly addressed the Irish role in enslavement and colonialism. And I should mention that my role and all of the exhibitions that I work on are funded by the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, and they're typically shown in Dublin and then taken to venues overseas by Irish embassies and missions. And I think it's encouraging that we have a diplomatic service in Ireland that is prepared to support these kinds of conversations. So the exhibition I'll mostly talk about today, it was launched in 2023. It was called Entangled Islands, and it looked at the historic relationships between Ireland and the Caribbean from the very first decades of English settlement. And the exhibition does primarily focus on the English or British Caribbean. We look at indentured labourers who arrived in colonies like Barbados, and then later Irish enslavers, Irish merchants who made huge profits through this transatlantic trade, and also the Irish role in colonial governance. And then moving into more recent history, we also highlight some of the links between Irish and Caribbean writing and anti-colonial discourse. And these will all be very familiar stories to historians of Ireland and Empire, but a lot of the kind of people who come through our doors are not aware of these aspects of Irish history.
That's excellent. Thank you. And Giselle, your work also pertains to Ireland and the Caribbean. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research, specifically Cuba?
Yes, thank you for having me and for inviting me. In terms of my own, how do I get to Irish studies? I thought to start there. So I did my bachelor's at the University of Havana in Cuba, where I'm originally from. In the summer of 2016, after I graduated from my bachelor's, I started going to local parish archives, mostly, honestly, out of boredom. But I started perusing these local archives and started finding lots of Irish families there. And I was like intrigued by that because it's not something that is very well known in Cuba that this migration existed. So I started kind of collecting the family names and kind of putting together my own archive of these histories. And that brought me to my current institution, Concordia University. I'm at the School of Irish Studies here. And I have been doing a project for the past decade, essentially building a database of all the Irish immigrants to Cuba. And that database does not just include Irish immigrants, it includes people that they engage with, including enslaved people. So I've been trying to essentially put the migrants and everybody in their social sphere, on the map and visualize it in a way that it allows people to see this history in a kind of like a didactic way and learn from it. In collaboration with other colleagues, we've then started digitizing these archives, putting them online. We collaborated with the University of Galway in doing that. Already a first batch is available. And then we've been mining these archives, looking for all the information that contextualizes this migration to Cuba, with the idea of kind of like bringing into the conversation of Ireland and Atlantic and Empire, the non-Anglophone Caribbean, which also had a significant Irish presence, and they play also a very important role in processes of slavery, plantation, colonialism, anti-colonialism. So I think it's kind of important to bring the Irish from what I call non-traditional diaspora destinations into the conversation as well, and put kind of also because they have also unique experiences with racialization, for example, in Cuba, which is what I'm looking at the moment. There's a whole debate about their role in whiteness and whitening the Cuban nation. And that is also something that is not very known in the Irish diaspora in general. So I'm going to leave it there and we can continue to have a conversation about this.
Thank you, Giselle. That's really wonderful. And I'd actually like to follow up with you right away. So no rest for you, I guess. I'm curious to hear a bit more about on the subject of the Irish and racialization in Cuba. I saw that some of your research pertains to Irish burials in Cuba, the role of the Irish on coffee plantations. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. So my master's project looked at specifically the role of Irish immigrants, Quaker immigrants. They were not Catholic, so that's already kind of like something that distinguished them. They became Catholic in Cuba out of necessity, but they come from a Protestant background in Ireland, and everything that entails, because there's also a history of colonization there. They arrived in Cuba and they purchased land, a massive amount of land in the mountains of the eastern region of Cuba, where they pursued coffee plantations. But to finance this, they engaged, of course, in the slave trade, and they made huge fortunes with that. And my project kind of like wanted to identify who these people were, what did they do, how did they amass this wealth, and what did they do with it? And if my question was also, did it make it back to Ireland in some form of way? Was there any kind of back and forth relation across the Atlantic? And there was, in fact, some money going back to some of these families. Then I kind of extended that same lens to the rest of the island. And I started to map out other types of plantations that the Irish engaged with, not just as like slave owners and also plantation owners, but also as labor, and looking at more less wealthy Irish immigrants and also their role in a slave society, as Cuba was. And this is all what's currently informing my PhD dissertation, which is being written on kind of like this Irish role as whitening agents and participating on kind of both sides of these processes as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And Dr. Hussein, if you don't mind a two-part question, I'd love to hear a little bit about if and how the idea of the Irish as whitening agents, or the process of whitening, has come up in your own research. And more generally, Giselle mentioned her work creating a database. I'd be curious to know more about your experience working in the archives at Trinity or elsewhere, and what strategies you've used.
Yeah, so in terms of thinking about kind of whiteness and Ireland and Irish identities and whiteness in America, one of the other things I'm working on as part of our book is thinking through the role of blackface and Orientalism. This partly comes back from some images that we have seen of a rag tradition. So rag is traditionally kind of a student-run kind of fundraising tradition that has been running in Ireland, and the aspect I'm looking at is the photos we've seen are from the 1920s and 30s, which involved donning blackface and dressing up as either Pacific Islanders or in Eastern garb. And these are kind of similar to the kind of blackface and rag traditions happening in other places in British universities and colleges, including in Edinburgh. So one of the things I'm doing at the moment is thinking through the dynamics of such imperially coded racist practices within Trinity at the time, but widely in the Republic. And this has also sparked a broader interest in working on blackface and minstrelsy in Ireland. There has been quite a little bit of work thinking through how Irish people in America have been part of blackface and minstrel shows. However, there's not been as much research done on either theatrical tours that were occurring that included Black people in Ireland, or in minstrel shows within Ireland themselves. So I really hope to kind of build on the work that's done on formations of whiteness and white identity of Irish Americans by thinking a little bit more about the broader role of that formation, both in Ireland and the Atlantic. So that's kind of one element that I'm thinking about, is specifically blackface within the university, but broadly as well. But in terms of thinking about my other work to do with colorism in South Asia, one of the things I look at in a case study I have within my book is thinking about railway communities, particularly made up of Anglo-Indians who are often of Irish descent. And so I think through how their formations of home, and particularly in terms of thinking about their home in Britain, were formed through kind of thinking about certain types of dress and work, but also in terms of specific whitening practices. So that may be purchasing particular items like skin lighteners, or making sure they don't get darker quite physically by wearing hats. Also, in terms of thinking about marriage, a lot of Anglo-Indian women often wanted to kind of quote unquote marry up, and this is a phenomenon you see in the Caribbean as well as in America, where this idea of, you know, you marry someone with a lighter skin shade will enable you to have some social capital and have children that are lighter. So they're very kind of physical whitening practices, as well as general ideas in terms of proximity to whiteness when it comes to thinking about what home means for your identity. So that's kind of thinking about the kind of Irish whitening agent side of things. Can you repeat your second question about the archive?
Yeah, and that really is the question. What has it meant for you? What sort of archives have you used, and what have been your strategies approaching your different groups of sources?
Yeah, well, I will say something about the Trinity Archive here is one of the things that I have struggled with, and I suppose anyone working on a project based on a university has been contending with how to kind of work through sources collected within an archive about the institution itself. So the usual kind of questions that colonial historians have about what was deemed, what kind of sources were collected and deemed collectible. So in terms of thinking about knowledge production, but also in terms of thinking about the ways in which things are categorized. So when we're thinking about collections and how certain books or certain items are collected, I've often had conversations with archivists and librarians in Trinity, thinking about, well, actually, is this the correct label? And especially when it comes to more harmful characterizations or catalogized, the way things are marked or catalogued, whether the kind of descriptors used to place things in archives are not just recreating kind of a colonial schema once more, and kind of re-inscribing the harm that comes with often racialized depictions of peoples and places. So that's one of the challenges that I had within the archives. I probably could go on, but I think I'll leave it there for now.
That's very fascinating. And on that subject of trying to avoid unwittingly creating colonial schemas, as you've mentioned, Dr. Healy, is that featured in your work at all, curating museum exhibits?
Absolutely, yeah. And sensitivity is obviously an important consideration when you're writing about enslavement. And so for our Untitled Islands exhibition, you know, we followed many others in deciding to avoid the term slave, for example. We referred instead to enslave people, to really reinforce that this was a violence perpetrated on people by other people. And we engaged a Guyanese historian, Joanne Collins Gonzalez, who also provided us with sensitivity reading and gave us guidance on appropriate language. Imagery as well is something that we have to think about as well. Obviously, most plantation images that we have access to are produced by 18th and 19th century artists, and they basically amount to, you know, idealized visions of enslavement, you know, well-clothed men and women working under blue skies, looking perfectly contented and at peace. And you know, even in cases where that is the only possible image that can be used to illustrate, you know, a particular place at a particular point in time, it's really important, obviously, to emphasize the particular perspective of the artist in question, and to reiterate that the reality was obviously far from that. There can be questions even over images published by abolitionists. So one of the images that we featured in the exhibition, it's a well-known late 18th century illustration commissioned by abolitionists that showed enslaved Africans crammed into a Liverpool trafficking ship called Brooks. So this is a ship that could hold more than 400 people. as it traveled across the Middle Passage. And this is a diagram that gives you an idea of just how horrific the conditions must have been on board. Some museum professionals have had reservations about displaying this kind of image. It's been argued that it could be seen to show people as disempowered, but we took the view that, you know, this kind of impersonal diagram could also serve to really reinforce the barbaric, dehumanizing logic of this whole trade. And we really made a conscious effort throughout the exhibition to stress that enslaved Africans were far from resigned to life in captivity.
Thank you. And Dr. Gray, your experience with sources, I imagine this is rather different, conducting interviews. What has been your strategy to do these interviews, and then how do you go about interpreting them?
I suppose I haven't done a lot of interpreting yet, really, Eamon, in terms of like, as informally, it's been trying to kind of collect as many as possible and really kind of get stuck in terms of giving people agency to talk about you see, a lot of the people I have interviewed, their proximity to Irishness is actually quite close. It's a parent or a grandparent or a white ancestor, an Irish ancestor that they knew about. And this is the first time that they formally, institutionally, intellectually had a space where it's been kind of, I guess, validated in terms of a story that's part of the Irish diaspora, right? You know, I suppose it takes you, by oral history, you know, just by definition, just takes you so much experientially out of dealing with the regular sources that we are used to as historians, which makes it a challenge, but also makes it very grounding in terms of the lived experiences of people and how people want to share them and contribute them to an archive. I will say, in some of the other work that I've done, and I just haven't the capacity to get to have done more of it yet, but I would like to do it. I did a chapter a few years ago in a collection actually co-edited by Dara on the global revolution, and I tried to put the early the early gestation of Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism in dialogue with Irish nationalism. I think our field is really chock full of ways in which, even Mobeen is talking there about minstrelsy, and she's so right about the Irish part of the story. There are big gaps in our knowledge in the transatlantic space, and the siloing that happens in terms of what actually, I think it's a really important place to say this. The other big, really rewarding part of this work has been the collaboration at an intellectual level with scholars who work on themes around the Irish, in particular African-American history, who we don't, as Irish studies scholars or Irish historians, historically, we're doing better in recent years, but we haven't done enough work on that. And there's great potential in both directions in terms of putting these kind of histories into more dialogue. So I think that actually intellectually, and how we then maybe translate that forward in terms of future collaboration, is something that I'm quite excited about. But I think I've said enough for now, if that's okay.
Thank you. That sets up my last question very well. And we will have questions from the audience. I'm conscious I've hogged the mic this entire time. Before I turn it over to the audience for their questions, I'd like to ask you, beginning with Dr. Hussein, where you think the field should go next, what kind of work you would like to see young historians doing, yourself included. Dr. Hussein.
Thank you for that. I think one of the key things, and I think Miriam's already talked about this, actually to kind of out myself, as it were. My interest initially was my kind of, so I say I'm a historian of the British Empire because my PhD was on colonial South Asia, but then I was interested, and I've always been interested in Ireland, but I was interested in particularly this Colonial Legacies project. And so, and that's one of the things that struck me when Miriam was talking, is that actually I think that's a real strength in our project, is that we all, so Karen and Patrick and I, we all work on different periods, and in different elements of colonial history, whether that's working on Ireland, the Caribbean, or working on different aspects of Ireland and the quote unquote world. And so I definitely think that's one of the directions that we can see, and we're already seeing it with having a symposium like this today. But thinking about the connections and not to flatten out kind of differences when it comes to kind of ideas around, as I mentioned earlier, racialization and whiteness, but also in terms of thinking about when we're thinking about colonial actors as British, what does that actually mean? Are we thinking about kind of a specific role of the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, and what that actually means when thinking about colonialism and enslavement, and thinking about those kind of regional identities will help us be a bit more careful about the way we think about racialization over time, especially when we're thinking about both colonial and settler colonial histories. So I think that's probably one of the areas that I'm most excited about, is kind of Irish studies going global in a sense.
Excellent. And Giselle, what new areas of research are you most excited about?
Thank you for the question. I was kind of briefly reflecting about exactly for whom are we researching, for whom we are doing these projects. In my case in particular, I constantly get emails from descendants of Irish people in Cuba or elsewhere, and they inquire about more information about their own ancestors. So when I started to conceive in my project, I wanted it to be a resource for these people, for academics and non-academics as well, and to have it become a dialogue. So in terms of directions in Irish studies, I would perhaps would like to see that more, kind of like understanding that we are researching areas that need to have engagement and feedback from the public as well, and have that kind of two-way conversation into what we are looking into, but also how it has impacted people's lives through time until today as well. So that would be kind of like my stamp on it.
Very good. And Dr. Gray, same question to you.
I suppose I think and sorry, I missed some of I was at the very first panel, but I've missed a lot of today because of other personal constraints. But it's my birthday, and I'm so delighted you're calling me. I'm so delighted you're all calling me early career when I'm not too far from 50. But anyway, or a young scholar. I think you know, I would like to reference like the moment that we're in. You know, my intellectual partners on some of this work are based at NYU, Dr. Kim DaCosta, Christine Cornelia, Quinnipiac. There are concerns about the moment we're in, especially in terms of the United States. And I feel, you know, that we have to keep up the momentum in terms of raising our voices and keeping up with this work, even when it gets difficult. And I would like to, as Catherine referenced earlier, the support that we've gotten for Black, Brown and Green and for African American Irish Diaspora Network from the Department of Foreign Affairs has just been absolutely pivotal to get some of this work off the ground and to sustain it. So the ways in which we can just leverage that support, that, you know, it's really meaningful when I go out to, you know, people in the community in the United States and say, you know, this is, you know, kind of supported by the Irish government at that level. That's really meaningful in terms of this work. But the one thing I'd like to see more of, we're beginning to see it, and I worry about the state that we're in terms of universities, about mentoring, you know, people who look more like my son than me about this kind of work, because that's what we need more of. We need people coming up who are Black Irish and Brown Irish or whatever. And, you know, as Giselle referenced in Cuba, people in different places who are coming into these conversations, and just add more nuance to our understanding of the Irish diaspora that all too often gets really just kind of focused on, you know, the American experience. And I love that. I've spent a lot of time doing it, but it's not the only one. And I think we learn more from kind of adding more to those layers of understanding and analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And then lastly, Dr. Healy, what sort of new work would you like to see done, maybe especially in the public history museum space?
Sure. I mean, I think there's certainly scope for a lot more work on Irish women in the Caribbean. And one of my favorite stories from our Caribbean exhibition was Kate Donlan and Frank Cahill, who were two Irish teachers who went over to Trinidad and Tobago in the late 1930s and were sacked 2 years later for their anti-British and ultra-socialist views, as the school authorities described them. And they went on to found a really progressive monthly magazine that you know, addressed the flaws of colonial rule, both in the Caribbean and in Ireland. Jennifer McLaren's been doing really good work on earlier period, and, you know, even like the British compensation records from the 1830s, there's plenty of Irish women's names there, you know, and that was one of the arguments made against abolition, that, you know, you'd be depriving the poor spinsters and widows of their modest income if they had to give up the enslaved worker to which they felt entitled. But yeah, just to follow up on Miriam's point, I think there's still a lot of work to do to push these kind of conversations into the public domain. Like, I see at Epic all the time the extent to which tourists and particularly, let's be honest, Irish Americans don't like to talk about these kinds of Irish histories. They're very familiar with the Great Famine and with the 1916 Easter Rising, but the fact that there are mixed race Irish Jamaicans, that there are descendants of Irish enslavers still living in the Caribbean, is a conversation that is still pretty uncomfortable. And, you know, I was in Barbados a few months ago for the launch, the first Caribbean launch of the exhibition. And it was amazing to see their luxury hotel and residential property being developed along the very shores where enslaved Africans have been disembarked at Bridgetown. And that is a history that developers, again, do not acknowledge in any way. And there's one particular European-headed property project that has a logo with the phrase "established 1657," referring to the year that merchants began using this particular pier. And you can guess, you know, who was making the produce that was being shipped out from these very shores. So I think, you know, if we're thinking about decolonization, part of the work is about ensuring that it extends beyond museums and educational spaces and into, you know, tourism and property development, and the huge number of British and American and Irish investors who are making a lot of money in the Caribbean right now.
Thank you, Dr. Healy. And for our remaining time, I'd like to turn it over to our audience so they can ask you guys a few questions.
Hi, so I have a question for Dr. Healy, and it mainly concerns the topic of public history. So I would like to know the challenges that came with putting this exhibition together, as well as the different responses you got from the Irish public and any foreign visitors writ large. And also, again, when it comes to like addressing this history at a more like international level in the Caribbean, like what could be done, for example, in Barbados to help improve legacy of slavery there, but also at the same time for the law resorts even to come to terms with where they're located at, for example.
I'll try to answer some of those questions. And generally, the reception in Ireland and in Barbados has been pretty positive. In the Barbados Museum is a great team headed up by Alessandra Cummins, and one of their curators, Natalie Maguire, has been collating feedback. And we have, as part of the exhibition, we have a magnetic wall with the question, what do Ireland and the Caribbean have in common? And people can write on a post-it note and stick it up. So the team there has been keeping track of the kind of comments that have been written. Lots of mentions of shared cultural connections, obviously, We had a short video as part of the exhibition as well, exploring the experiences of Irish people of Caribbean heritage. So, you know, a lot of people coming to the exhibition are members of the wider Caribbean diaspora in Britain and in North America. So those kind of stories really resonated with them. But there is still pushback to, like I found particularly among Irish descended people that I spoke to in Barbados. You know, in the exhibition, we make clear that there is a very clear distinction between enslavement and indentured labor. That is something that I found the myth of the Irish slaves that Patrick referenced earlier is still very much alive and well among some pockets of the remaining Irish community in Barbados, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions for our panelists? Okay.
I have a question for Giselle. Have you found like information about the environmental or ecological adaptation of Irish people in Cuba, since Ireland and Cuba have very different environments, very different ecologies? Have you found information about this process and difficulties that may have brought?
So to reiterate, you're asking me about, because the audio was a bit sounded distant, environmental impact of Irish immigrants in Cuba. Well, for starters, the ones that were very involved in plantation processes, that they were directly responsible for processes of deforestation and erosion and changing the Cuban landscape to adapt to monocrop kind of economy. It's particularly visible still in the coffee plantations that are still there, like the remains of this places are still visible in the landscape, and they have significantly contributed to making the ecosystems of the area suffered. I actually published a paper going more in detail about that a specific topic, and I also contributed to the Archaeology Ireland magazine with a piece on the archaeological remains of these plantations, what their current state is, who owns it. They are owned currently by the Cuban government, but they are trying to kind of like reframe these plantations as a kind of like a tourism site that people can go and like interact with. But I question, okay, if they're a tourist site, then what kind of preservation is going to go into place? What kind of environmental impact is that going to also cause in the future? Be kind of mindful. At the moment, many of these sites are not very accessible. After, I think there was a hurricane in 2012 that destroyed most of the access road to them. I did a effort in 2020. Actually, Scholar Kirby Miller was with me on that expedition. We tried to get to one of the sites of this plantation, and the road was in very, very bad shape. You had to literally hike through the forest to get there. So yeah, definitely there's I'm only kind of delving into specific group of coffee plantations in the east of Cuba, but there's a lot more attention to be done into other areas of the country where definitely Irish people had a lot of impact in the landscape, and it's still visible today. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Giselle.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if you we've spoken a lot about the Irish diaspora. There have been diasporas about many other peoples across the planet. Are your colleagues doing things about the Italians and enslavement, or Germans, or French, or Polish? Or is there something unique about Ireland, or is it just that there are people looking at it? But if you looked at these other diasporas, and I'm thinking even just to the United States, we had Chinese, we had German, French, Polish. Is there other research on those other communities and their impact on or engagement in enslavement?
Whoever would like to field that.
I can speak for Cuban studies perspective. There's a lot of research that has been done specifically about French people. After the Haitian Revolution, a lot of the wealthy white owners relocated to Cuba. And of course, they also participated in all these processes. And that is a very well documented history. So I'd say the curiosity from a Cuban studies perspective about the Irish is that there's many groups that have been already discussed as participating in this history, but the Irish is still one that hasn't as much.
Thank you. And Dr. Gray, did you also want to answer that question?
Yeah, I haven't come across a lot of it, and I like comparative stuff, and I interact with people who work on different groups quite a lot. I've just always been wired that way. So when I'm grumbling about all the stuff we need to do on the Irish, like my Italian, I've a very eminent sociologist friend who works on Italian identity in America, and she's always there's nothing like this in the study of Italians. There's a bit of work on you know, kind of Blackness in Jewish America. There's some work done in that. What's innovative about what we're trying to do with the work with Black, Brown and Green and African American Irish diaspora is to bring together, you know, the work of scholars like myself and some of my colleagues on the board in a public space, and into what Catherine spoke to in terms of transcending the academy and trying to get at people who wouldn't naturally encounter these kinds of conversations. So I think there's a lot more scope to be done in terms of when I was at NYU, a lot of my colleagues there were really excited about the modeling that we're doing with this work. But I would also say chronologically and demographically, I mean, there's so much work and there's so much potential in the Irish experience in the United States and the Caribbean in particular, because of our presence, that the other groups don't have to the same extent, or they don't necessarily, well, no, I won't. I don't see as much kind of engagement in terms of a community level around celebrating that in the way that some of this work that we're trying to do. So I think the Irish, not to exceptionalize them, because but I think there's unique potential because of our position within the empire. Let's face it. So I think I'd love to have more conversation with people across other groups, because I think that would yield a lot of really interesting stuff.
Thank you. I think we have time for 3 more questions. We can take them all at once, and then you guys can feel free to answer whatever speaks to your work. So in the front.
In the morning session, we talked a fair amount about religion and in the role of in this Irish experience. Could you talk about it particularly in the Caribbean or in any of your other work that you're doing? Does it play a role in what's going on? Thank you.
Mine is probably too big. I've just been thinking that all morning we've been talking about the Irish abroad, as if the history of Ireland happened elsewhere. And I was wondering about, when we look back to Ireland itself in the 19th and 20th century, what does a history of slavery or an understanding of slavery on the island of Ireland look like? And I guess it's probably for Mobeen, maybe, and Catherine. Mobeen because of the Trinity College work, and Catherine because of EPIC. But I wanted to turn it backwards a little bit, but we probably don't have time.
Did we have one more? Yeah.
Mine was more of a comment, so this will be quick, but I was particularly interested in Dr. Gray's work about the African American diaspora and the Irish diaspora in America, and a comment on the follow-up on a question that was recently asked in the front. This is a personal anecdote, and so it may not be translatable, but I might have an adopted son who's African American, and from his family was from the South. We don't know exactly. He's married to another African American woman whose family was from New York. The two of them recently did their 23andMe genetic testing. Both of them are nearly 15% Irish. And they have the rest of them is from different African nations and from my daughter-in-law, some South Asian. But there are no Italian, there's no German, there's no French. It's so for whatever that means, it's one incident, two people, but they both have strong Irish genes.
Thank you. So we have the role of religion and then Ireland in Ireland. Whoever would like to take those.
Maybe I'll say something about Ireland in Ireland, partly because it does link to the earlier question. And I think one of the reasons why, and something I was struck as someone who's from the UK who went to live in Ireland to work on this project. There's very much an idea when thinking about kind of even colonization abroad, this idea of really taking it within kind of the national public consciousness of the people I spoke to anyway, this idea of kind of the Irish oppressed not leaving room for any other forms of oppression or marginalization elsewhere. So I've had people say, well, Ireland didn't colonize anyone. And, you know, we've had to have a little bit more of a conversation. Well, when we're thinking about structures of colonization, what does that mean? There was lots of, you know, specifically in certain kinds of fields. So in soldiers, medics, planters, there's a huge influx of Irishmen, particularly from the elite classes, but also middle classes as well, after the Union, going into the Caribbean and other parts of the empire. But this idea still holds, as you know, we were the first English colony, and so that sometimes kind of precludes any sort of conversation. It's kind of difficult to have that conversation, and so placing that back into the equation, thinking again in more nuanced way, you can be both colonial and colonized as well as a colonizer. So I think that's one of the reasons why there is this focus on Ireland. And it's still conversations that even both academically and non-academically, it's still kind of almost sidelined, and where we hope with a lot of other people doing this work, including in EPIC, but also at other universities, that these questions come back to the centre a little bit within our institutions and beyond.
Thank you.
I would like to add to the 23andMe genetic aspect of this conversation. In my own dissertation at the moment, when I'm looking at processes of whiteness and whitening, the Cuban historiography somewhat agrees that these processes kind of fail and ended in the 19th century, and that's kind of like the end of the story. But recent research by Cuban geneticists are looking at kind of like the impact of specific groups and ethnic groups and populations in the current makeup of the Caribbean and the Cubans alive today, and are kind of changing that conversation. Are looking at this, for example, when 1,000 to 2,000 Irish workers were brought to build the railroad in Cuba in 1835. Well, what happened to those people? Well, the project failed. Many of them left, but many of them remained, and they married, and they have families, and they passed on their genes. So there's a lot of kind of like I don't like to call it revisionist, but there's a lot of like revision being done into how these whitening schemes unfolded and what contribution was passed on by specific groups. I don't want to be accused of being biologist or like too centered around biology, but I think it is important to kind of look at these historical processes from new perspective, and genetic studies and population studies and anthropology are doing very interesting work in kind of like bringing into the present these processes and putting new data available that can inform this conversation. So as someone also has like 4% Irish myself and discovered that through my research, it's interesting to see that can be tell in using this kind of historical source, which is DNA, but then you go to the written sources and there's like a gap there that it will never probably recover. So my whole kind of thesis, if you want to call it, is to bring into this other conversation from other fields into history, and what can that inform, like this new perspectives in a way.
Thank you. That resonates quite nicely with our interdisciplinary theme, in addition to international for the day. So I think that's all the time we have. But if you would join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Maybe they'll be joining us in person for the next time.
Yeah.
Thank you again, everybody.
Yeah.
We should say as well, thank you to our expert chair, even better. We've all worked exceptionally hard, which means coffee and cake for you. Thank you.